Europe generally accorded the status of a full continent because of its great physical size and the weight of history and tradition. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 467 AD and the subsequent migration period marked the end of Europe's ancient history and the beginning of the Middle Ages. Humanism, Renaissance, and other factors led to the modern era. Just before the Middle Ages, the continent is also said to be engaging in mutual aid relationships but without the help of outside authorities. However, the weak and the disabled were either neglected or abandoned, for they were seen as burden. Not just that, but it was also the fact that humans back then did not know how to cope with these conditions. With the rise of religion, not later Middle Ages, the priests assumed responsibility for the disadvantaged groups. They committed their work in helping the less fortunate members of the community in a way of giving alms and donations. Therefore, it was well known at that time that priests were the ones giving motives for helping the needy. On the 16th century, believed as a period of Reformation, came to realize in making efforts to establish local authorities to instead assume responsibility in helping the handicapped and the poor. This was a success also in the following centuries, but with many and different laws, policies, and principles due to changes of authorized person depending on his or her views or amendments. But all were distributive and captivating in the lives of people. Though some were faced by severe punishments and cruelty, they still managed to cope with these hardships. The Age of Enlightenment shaped the continent socially, culturally, and politically from the end of 17th century until the first half of the 19th century. The Industrial Revolution, which began at the end of 18th century, gave rise to radical economic, cultural, and social change in Western Europe and eventually the wider world. Today, European Union is established to improve public health, prevent human illness and diseases, and to identify sources to these dangers to human health which may be due to financial crisis. They view human rights as well as universal and interdependent. Countries along also provide social work education since they have built universities or equivalent higher education institutions with regards to the practice.
Evolution of social work in Europe from Middle Ages to 21st century. Middle Ages. With the growth of religion, priests assume responsibility for the disadvantaged groups by sharing worldly goods like giving alms and donations, which make it clear to say that religious piety is their motive for giving, just like what the ancients also did back then. Care of the poor was through church activities during that time. As Christianity grew, monasteries established institutions to give shelters for the homeless and handicapped people. This therefore resulted to mendicancy in Europe and continued towards the end of Middle Ages, but not later. These monasteries and institutions turned into hospitals with the donations from royal and aristocratic families in Europe. 14th century, England made a distinction between the two classes of poor. The first one is the able-bodied and the second one is the impotent poor. Between 13th and 5th centuries, parish churches are responsible for caring for the poor and the needy. Their work is by relief activities of the guilds for the reason of brotherhood and fellowship. The Statute of Laborers on 1349 by King Edward III is the first law for the poor to accept any employment from masters willing to hire them in order to prevent the thought of begging. If ever there still exists this, extremely cruel punishments were ordered from beggars and vagrants. 15th century. Germany in 1520 started the idea of stop begging, but instead create a common chest, donations of citizens to help the needy. This also happened in other European nations, but they were criticized for this because it led to the thought of abuse of funds.
During 16th century, also known as the period of Reformation, efforts were started to make local authorities assume responsibility to helping the needy. This is the beginning of act to make communities responsible in helping field. It took a Spanish philosopher Juan Luis Vives to call attention to the need to look into the social condition of the needy. Also, a scientist at his time developed a program of poor relief system, dividing the cities into the parish quarter with team assigned to investigate such social condition. On 1531, the Statute of Henry marked the beginning of recognition of public responsibility for the poor. Because of this, legislation were established through taxation to also fund the poor relief system. During 17th century, previous legislation were codified into the Poor Law of 1601, later called the Elizabethan Poor Law of 1601, making the communities responsible for the maintenance of the poor and having an important feature of resident or settlement right as a qualification for relief. Father Vincent de Paul, an important reformer of charities in the Catholic Church, created a lay order called Ladies of Charity, who visit the poor and giving them food and clothes. In 1633, he also founded Daughter of Charity, which is by nursing the sick and the handicapped.
On 18th century, the Poor Law was amended on 1782 as the Gilbert Act, from indoor to outdoor relief, where people should be maintained in their own homes until they found employment. Another was the Spin-Hamdag Act of December 34, 1795. Relief allowances in the homes of the poor according to the size of the family for support. A Spanish minister at the same time from Scotland organized the program of private charity on the principle of neighborly aid. On 1853, the poor relief system came to be known as the Elberfeld system since it was introduced in the city of Elberfeld, financing it from public taxation. On 19th century, new poor law on August 14, 1834 made further changes in the existing poor laws. The social philosophy and practice of poor relief in England was influenced by the social reform movements, Octavia Hill and Chartists. Charity organization societies, which is the Charity Organization Society, Toynbee Hall, and methods of social research as to conduct research regarding the real conditions of thousands of employed workers' families. London Charity Organization Society organized a program of relief upon the ideas of Reverend Thomas Chalmer. They laid the first ever individual approach in social work called casework.
In the 20th century, it was the beginning of serious threat of unemployment,
Poor Law Commission 1905 established a social reform which marked the start of social legislation in England, and during the World War II, in the year of 1939, there is the re-examination of the entire British social insurance and welfare program. In the year 1839 was the payment of allowance to war victims, and in 1841 they abolished the responsibility of grown-up children for their parents. 21st century is the European Union. It has a significant influence on the development of national social policies through EU directives and human rights principles. Interest is growing among public authorities, services providers, users, and other stakeholders in the debate on the quality of social services. The Commission supports the development of a voluntary EU quality framework providing guidelines on how to set, monitor, and evaluate quality standards. This initiative is part of strategy, which includes financing of bottom-up, transnational projects to develop mechanisms for defining, measuring, assessing, and improving the quality of social services. In European Union, social services play a crucial role in improving quality of life and providing social protection. They include social security, employment and training services, social housing, child care, long-term care, and social assistance services.